Get ready! On this episode of Sega Talk, we're talking the sequels to Space Harrier, the 3D graphics, the Sega Genesis exclusive, and the never-before-released to consoles arcade game from Nagoshi. All this and more on Sega Talk. Sega Bits presents Sega Talk, a podcast talking all things Sega! With your hosts, George and Barry.
Look, it's a giant talking egg. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the master here. So what?
Hello and welcome to episode 84 of Sega Talk. I'm Barry. With me is...
George. Right?
That's right. There we go. I'm keeping you on your toes. And on this episode, we are covering the Space Harrier sequels, specifically Space Harrier 3D, Space Harrier 2, and I can't hold it, but it's somewhere in the world, Planet Harriers. And the reason we're covering 3 and 1 is these are not big games. I don't think they're games that could cover a full episode. And also, I just think it's really interesting to cover all of them at once because there's some comparing, contrasting that we can do. It's also really exciting for me because this is kind of a personal favorite of mine. We covered the original game way back in 2017 on our 11th show. And we actually managed to talk about that little arcade title for over an hour. So I definitely think it's worth revisiting. We are actually going to talk a little bit about the original game just because there has been some new additions to the original's, I guess, ports library. Before we do that, though, so this episode, this is a personal pick of mine. However, if you support us on Patreon at a certain tier, what's the name of that tier? All these tiers have beautiful names. It's the $20 tier. I'll just call it that. You get to tell us what to cover, and you get to have one pick a month. And so we really appreciate the picks that we're getting. We appreciate the people that are making these picks because they push us outside our comfort zone. I mean, this is a comfort zone pick for me. And I think following after the episode you're doing next, which we'll reveal at the end of the show, it's pretty much Patreon picks for the next 2 months, which is exciting. And we have a really great group of people picking our episodes, sharing their memories. And I'll just give some little teases. We are going to be covering Shenmue 2 and 3 in the next few months. We're covering some oddball titles. I won't reveal them just yet, but there's also a little game that just came out to the backwards compatibility program for Xbox, so look forward to that. And yeah, so I mean, some often requested titles are coming, but until then, let's talk about Space Harrier. Welcome to the Fantasy Zone. Get ready. So it's been a while. Let's just quickly share our thoughts on the original game before diving into the sequels. And again, if you didn't listen to that episode, definitely throw that on and then catch this one, just because we cover so much on that first game. But George, what are your just brief thoughts on the original Space Harrier?
It's a beautiful a rail shooter with some very unique graphics, very unique world, very unique villains that I don't know if any other games ever captured quite like it. I think they're very 80s aesthetic, very never before never ending story type weirdness in this. I would say it's very in the grand scheme of Sega AM2, it's a very original title, and it's probably one of the most standout titles they released in the 80s because everything else was simulation of a Ferrari or fighting gunships or racing something. And this was I don't think they ever made anything quite like this ever again either. So yeah, definitely a unique title. Very good treat. You?
Yeah, and I actually re-listened to that episode before we recorded. And that really, your opinions really haven't changed on it. And mine have not either, though there has been one change for my Space Harrier experiences. I said on the 11th show that I've never completed the full game in the arcades. I've since done that multiple times because it's unlimited credits at the Galloping Ghost. And it's fun. It's cool to get to that the end screen. I think people notice when you're playing a game for a long time and they're like, oh, is he going to set a record or something? I'm never going to set a record on that thing. But it's a great experience, great game. And there's so many different ways to play it. I'm looking forward to talking about the latest way to play it. But until then, I will say that the Space Harrier franchise is small but mighty. Combined, there's just 4 games really under its belt that comprises the canon. The series does cross over with Fantasy Zone as both franchises take place within the Fantasy Zone. And so the first sequel, you'd think it was Space Harrier 2, but it's actually not. Let's throw the cover up. We have some beautiful cover art here. So this is the artwork for Space Harrier 3D. It was actually the next game in the franchise. It released on February 29th, 1988 in Japan and July 1988 in America, so not too long a wait. And the game actually made use of the console's Sega Scope 3D glasses peripheral, which plugged into the Sega Master System's card slot. So we have 2 pieces of art here. The first one, I think you can guess, is the Japanese art. It's beautiful. The second art is the American art, which... I mean, a lot is said about American or Western Master System art. I think this is actually some of the better art, and that's saying a lot. But, I mean, it looks like the game. I don't know who this giant creature, like this mecha that he's firing on is. Yeah,
neither do I. And, like... They always did this weird proportion on like some of the Master System. Whoever the artists were, like they didn't like understand how to draw humans that well. Sometimes it's weird. Like look how big his butt is on that.
Yeah, and I will say too, because it's a 3D game, I think the Japanese art does a much better job because it clearly shows like an enemy shooting past the player, like towards the viewer. And I think the color scheme also kind of matches the game because I remember the game having a lot of like reds and pinks and kind of darker backgrounds, probably so that the characters can pop more in the 3D. I'm going to assume you've never experienced a Master System in 3D though.
I will say yes, it's true. I haven't.
Yeah, and I'm not going to hold that against you because even I own a Master System and I own the 3D glasses. They don't work. I don't know why, but they don't. So
ever.
Well, so it's weird because I have a buddy, my friend Steve, who has a Master System. He has a working pair of 3D glasses. I mailed him mine, and I was like, test them. And he claims to have tested them, and they didn't work. But then he started to second-guess himself, and he's like, oh, wait, did I use the right card slot? And I'm like, did I just waste my time having you test them because you didn't we don't know. And... the card slot itself still works on my machine. I have absolutely no idea. But essentially, when you have a working pair of the Sega Scope 3D glasses, it's a flickering effect. So it basically, one eye goes dark and then the other eye goes dark like this, like constantly.
What the hell?
And it goes so fast that it alternates, I believe, with the screen. So your eye is seeing the left and right and left and right and left and right so fast that it merges them into one, which sounds like a headache, and I'm sure it is. There's a missile game, there's Outrun, but what really makes this one unique is that it's not a straight up port. It's actually a sequel. The game was developed by Sega R&D 2, which we've talked about many times in the past because they have released a ton of games to the point of Mark Cerny describing it as a sweatshop, if you remember that.
Yeah.
And it has I think it has a surprising amount of love in it, though, despite it being made by the sweatshop developer, just because they really went the extra mile to not just make it a 3D version. Like, for example, Outrun 3D had a lot of content removed, whereas this one is a brand new story. So, speaking of the story, let's read the plot. So it's the return of Space Harrier. Once the peaceful land of dragons had suffered under a reign of terror, evil creatures stalked the land, leaving death and destruction in their wake. A call went out to the furthest reaches of the galaxy for a champion brave enough to challenge this evil. The call was answered by Space Harrier, a young warrior with an atomic blaster and the ability to fly. With the help of Urea, the true dragon prince, Space Harrier defeated the enemies of the land of the dragons and returned the Dragon King to his throne. With peace again ruling the land, Space Harrier departed. So that's the first game. Then, 1 year later, the Dragon King died, and the land of the dragons was thrown into chaos. As Urea prepared to take the throne, his evil cousin returned from exile with an army of Urea's enemies. And if you don't recall, that's the giant, hairy dog that you fly on, the giant dragon. Yeah. So he has an evil cousin.
Oh, no.
In the violent battle that followed... No. Well... in the violent battle that followed, the evil cousin invaded Urea's castle and took the throne. Even worse, Urea disappeared. Now Space Harrier has returned to the land of dragons to find Urea and restore him as to the rightful throne. But this time he must journey further than he ever has before, right into the jaws of the most vicious monsters in the galaxy. To complete this mission, Space Harrier needs your help. The land of the dragons is depending on you. So what do you think about that plot?
Very, I guess, it's very strange. It's like, so now this other character has a cousin, and he's evil. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very reminiscent of like a fairy tale story, right?
Yeah, and there's, the Fantasy Zone games also do this a lot in their plots. There's a lot of like brothers and cousins and fathers and thrones and deaths. But what's so bizarre is that like Opa-Opa is a sentient spaceship, and in this case, it's like a giant snake dragon. But they, instead of like being wild animals or robots, they have like a royal caste system, and they have brothers and relatives, and they cry. It's just weird.
So like machines, and like this world has like machines and like animals also like both sentient beings. So like, isn't that weird? It almost feels like Space Harrier, maybe the guy, the Space Harrier might be enemies with Opa-Opa, maybe?
It is, and Persona-sama, the artist, and that's his Twitter handle, he does a lot of art for fighting games, and he's a big fan of the franchises. He has a Twitter thread, and I think a blog post that tries to like make sense of all the dates and like the timeline and how both franchises fit together. It's kind of a fascinating read. I think it's him more taking these elements that never were meant to be put together and putting them together, because I very much doubt that the person making this game was like, wait, what's going on in the Fantasy Zone right now? But
exactly.
I mean, there's a cool story there of like warring kingdoms of technology and like dragon beasts that we'll never see. What I think is really funny, though, is that Urea, the beast that you ride in the bonus stages, is kidnapped. So it's really a sneaky way to omit the bonus stages because they probably either take up memory or they were too hard to program in 3D. Another case of this on the Master System is actually Tails being kidnapped in Sonic 2. So what do you think about... 8-bit adaptations of games using kidnapping as an excuse to remove, like, gameplay content?
I mean, it's an easy way of doing it. I mean, I wonder how many kids back then, though, that had, like, the Master System would ask, like, the arcade version had this. I think it's probably way less, and it was just more, like, the developers overthinking it. I think if they never mentioned it or even cared about it, the kids playing it back then wouldn't even know about it, because, like... I don't know, like, how many people first owned the Master System, owned the 3D goggles, and then also had working 3D goggles that play this game, you know what I mean?
Right.
Talking about a percentage of a percentage of a percentage, but yeah, this is one of those weird games that I technically never played, so my thoughts on it are, like, I'm looking at it right now, and it looks really confusing. If you hook it up without the 3D glasses, can you actually play it? Well,
so what I was going to say was, I think if you like emulate it, what they do is instead of showing you the alternating images, they show you both eyes side by side. So a lot of the gameplay videos you will see is that perspective. Now, I'm not certain, but I think the way that those 3D games work is that there are two screens playing at the same time, which means that the 3D games have they're less technically impressive because the Master System is basically running the same game twice for each eye, and then the screen is alternating between the two. And technically that's pretty amazing that the glasses can talk to the screen and say, okay, you're showing the left, so I'm going to cover the right eye. You're showing the right, I'm going to cover the left. And I'm going to do that so fast that the brain can't process it as two separate images. You compare that to the 3DS, which basically forces you to cross your eyes a little bit. Like when you're playing the 3DS, you're not, like I'm doing it on the video. I'm pretty good at crossing my eyes, but you're like this when you're playing the game. And I think the closest thing to that is maybe home 3D systems like Blu-ray 3D. I know that it does similar technology, but probably to the point where it's flashing so fast that it's not as headache-inducing as the Master System. But have you ever done a 3D Blu-ray?
My cousin has a 3D TV with the glasses, so I did that before, but definitely not for me. I when it was like popular in the theaters, I did see a couple movies in it, and to me it was like kind of a headache, to be honest with you. It wasn't my cup of tea really to watch movies like that. I'm more laid back, just put the image on screen. And I also think that like a lot of movies didn't really make a good use of the 3D either. Like they just released whatever to just release them for a little bit more money. So I guess it depends, right?
Yeah.
I never saw Avatar, so
it's a gimmick that I think is really fading. I don't see it happening as much. In fact, there's been movie premieres that I actively avoid certain showings because I'm like, oh, it's 3D. I don't want to see that. Yeah. Especially for like franchises where I've seen like 3 or 4 movies, and then I'm like, really? You want me to go see Toy Story 4 in 3D? Like, nah, no, thank you. Yeah. So despite that technical limitation, though, the game does feature 12 stages, which I think is pretty impressive. Plus, there's an untitled boss rush. The stages were given weird names, and I'm just going to blow through a few of them here. There's Hardega, this is a crazy one, Mechamenum, Dote,
like metal.
And then my favorite, Bits.
Ooh.
Like Sega Bits.
Yes, of course.
Do you think thought was actually put into the Space Harrier stage names, or do you think the team would just make up nonsense words and like pick the best ones?
I don't know if they did it on here. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody was like, oh, actually, I combined the Spanish word with this German word, right? Like the language for like Panda Dragoon, for example, I think it's like Latin and German mixed together. So like I wouldn't be surprised, but to me it sounds like one of them sounds like a metal, right? Like that mechanmanium sounds like some sort of like weird comic book metal element that they found in some planet far away that is now destroying the Earth. So like maybe there's something going on there where they have like a foreign sound to them, you know what I mean? So I can see them thinking about them, but they're probably gibberish made up from them putting words together that they like.
Well, let's put you to the test. It's not in the notes, but I did want to do this. I'm going to read. We're going to do this 3 times. I'm going to say a name. You're going to tell me if it is an actual stage from a Space Harrier game or if I'm just making it up on the fly. Are you ready?
Ooh, this is going to be hard. Yeah, go for it.
Maura.
That's a stage.
Okay. Gibbon.
No. Is it a stage? Oh, man.
No, it's not.
Oh.
Yord.
No, I don't think so.
Yord is.
Okay.
Is. Yeah. So that's it's like see how
I got
easy
one
it is?
right at least, or 2
Gibbon.
right. Actually,
I like Gibbon. Gibbon's like a monkey.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I always I think the Space Harrier stage names are forgettable, but it's always fun to see them flash up on screen. When we get to Planet Harriers, you are going to be hitting your head against the desk with how stupid the titles are. It's like they didn't even try. It's like, come on, Nagoshi. Come on. So the game itself, it features the recognizable theme as well as new tracks. And, of course, Japanese fans getting all the good stuff. They have lovely FM synth sounds, which are actually in the playthrough we're watching. Though I don't believe we have the audio on, but you guys can search that out if you want to pause this and jump over, just give it a listen after the show. Or maybe we'll throw some up over the credits. I think that might be fun, some FM synth Space Harrier music. Now, here's what I find frustrating. If you don't own the 3D glasses, or if yours are broken like mine are, and you just want to play the game in 2D, you can. But here's how it works. So basically, you need to get a high score. You need to make the high scoreboard in 3D, and then you use the second controller to enter the name 3, Three, and the effect turns off. Why don't you just make it
a option?
A menu option. Yeah, a menu option. Like, imagine that. You're like, oh, I'm having my buddy over, but he has one eye. Or he has vision problems. Or he can't see 3D. It's like, accessibility did not exist back then. They were like, oh, you don't own the glasses? Too bad.
I get you got to sell the glasses, but, like, not having any option. This is what I hated, too. Like, they used to have those, like, light guns for the Super Nintendo, right? Remember they had that really big gun they used to sell as like a bazooka? They had like a bazooka for and they used to sell games for it, right? And you had to have the gun to play the games. You couldn't even play like a controller version of a light gun game. So it's like, I don't know why they did this. That was the worst. When you got that for Christmas,
right?
That's terrible.
I hate it. This is a weird modern console thing. I hate when you're trying to view the second, like the multiplayer options, and you select multiplayer from the menu, and it says, I see you don't have a second player controller plugged in. And I'm like, I only own one controller, but can I just see what the menu looks like for multiplayer so I can get an idea of, like, can I even start a stage and just have the controller, the second player not moving, so I at least can get an idea of, like, there's been games I've reviewed, and I just have to straight up say in the review, I never played the multiplayer because I don't own two controllers. Like, sorry.
Oh, man. Yeah, I didn't know. I never have that issue, but I can see where you're coming from. Like, especially when you just want to see it real quick for a review, like like this character select screen, at least. Yeah.
And I will say, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric has a good multiplayer mode. It was developed by a different developer, which is bizarre. They like tapped another developer to do it. I think Colonial Marines did the same thing.
Yeah,
I could be wrong, but it's a weird thing they did back then. You can play the game in 2D if you have one of the ports, which we will cover in a moment. But if you're in America, you're probably not going to have access to them. I have here a web link. You don't need to show it, but it's for the Cutting Room Floor, which is a cool site.
Very good.
Sometimes it shows deleted content. Other times it shows secrets. I believe we use them to look at boobies on the Dynamite Ducks episode. But basically, there's a few interesting secrets in the game. If you get a high score of 1 million points or more and enter the name Sound with the second controller, you unlock a sound test. And then if you play the sounds 7437481, a message comes up, and it's the weirdest thing. So the message, well, I'll read the message here. The message says, "Hello, this is ZHD 97591. Good fortune does not always repeat itself." And so this is kind of a weird broken English message that is telling you have correctly entered a code that actually did something in the first Space Harrier, but in this game, entering that same code does not do anything, but it does bring up a message telling you it's not doing anything. So it's basically saying, hey, sometimes when you enter a code, you're not going to get something. Like,
oh man, it's already setting us up for disappointment.
Have you ever seen an Easter egg acknowledge that the player has entered a code, but it's an Easter egg telling you you entered an Easter egg. Like,
but not only that, it's like telling you, it's like sometimes in life you don't get what you want, so here you go, disappointment. It's like you think you're smart, but you're not. Yeah.
Good fortune does not always repeat itself.
It also sucks that you spend so much money on like 3D glasses, a Master System, and you're like such a big, Space Harrier fan that this code, and then they give you this. This is your reward. Yeah. Nothing. Yeah.
It's like if you put up, down, left, right, A start on Sonic 2, and it was like a little message came up, and it's like, you successfully entered the level select code for Sonic 1. However, this is Sonic 2. Sorry.
Yeah.
There are ports of the game. I will say Americans are sadly out of options, though the game did see release on the Sega Ages 2500 Volume 20 Space Harrier Complete Collection. It still blows my mind that there were dozens of these Sega Ages collection for the PS2 that had amazing remakes and we were missing out on so much, and we have missed out on so much. But basically, this was a bonus game in both that collection and in the Sega 3D Fukoku Archives, which is a physical compilation of the 3DS 3D Classics games with new bonuses. However, this was, I believe, collection number 1 or 3. Here in America, we did get that physical collection, but that was a port of the second collection.
Yeah.
And what really sucks is that not only did they have exclusive Master System 3D games in those games, but they also had titles like Power Drift, which we did get a digital one of, with new modes. So the Power Drift that Japan got on the cartridge is basically an all-stars Sega game with characters from Space Harrier, Altered Beast in their own Power Drift cars. And I will say, as much as I love 3D Classics, and we worked with the community team, promoted that game, I think Sega West seriously dropped the ball in failing to release these bonuses, and I think the fact that they only released the second of 3 compilations absolutely sucked.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like that was recent too. It was just like, what were they thinking? What is idiots?
Yeah, and I think it was just like this really weird like transitional period where the 3DS was almost like on the way out. Like the 3DS already, when it was out, like when it first came out, people made fun of its technology, right? Because it went having to do 3D, so it had to scale back its games. So by this time, it was like everyone's wanting to move on to the Switch. I mean, maybe they should have just put them all on Switch, but it is what it is now.
Yeah, it just kind of pisses me off because I get it when it's like, oh, it's an RPG that's 40 hours and it's like little girls that turn into like, I don't know, weird video game consoles. I get that when it's like, it sounds cool, but I get that localizing it would take a lot of time. These are just straight up like games that require minimal translation, and they just don't give it to us. Oh well. Let's move on. Let's move on to our next title. So Space Harrier 2. Let's look at that beautiful, beautiful, bizarre art.
It's bizarre, but it's like probably the coolest art, I think, for the franchise. That they released. It has like a Medusa head. It has this weird checkered board. It looks really weird. It just looks like you died and you're in a fever dream, kind of.
And you bring up that Medusa head. I'm just now realizing that I used to think she was just kind of like a floating head there, like a graphical element, kind of like Sonic 2 with Eggman or Robotnik grabbing the two.
Yeah.
And he's like a floating head. I think that tail behind her, I think this is like a weird, like snake lady.
Yeah. I think that's what they're trying to do.
That's weird.
It's not in the game.
That's so weird.
Is it in the game? A lady like that? No, right?
I don't know if she is, though it is interesting that there's like lightning flashing in the background because that does play a role in the game. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think this is interesting artwork. It's not up there with some of the best, but it's definitely interesting.
It's bizarre.
So Space Harrier 2, yeah, bizarre for sure. It released as a launch title for the Mega Drive in Japan and the Sega Genesis in America on October 29th, 1988 and August 14th, 1989, respectively. So the game released alongside Super Thunderblade in Japan, reinforcing that the Mega Drive was initially marketed as a home arcade machine. So let's talk about that briefly here. So what do you think about Sega's early marketing efforts for the Mega Drive being sold as an arcade at home? Do you think that was the right way to sell the console?
I mean, there was obviously a disparity between the arcade titles and the Mega Drive titles. They were scaled down, and for a long time, Sega already had these hits, right, on the arcade. I think transitioning over, at the time, it made sense to work with what you got. Mm-hmm. But I think when Sega of America was like, all right, we got to hit the actual mainstream six, like bring new people in. This was like Sega trying to bring its arcade gamers to buy a Mega Drive. And I guess it technically didn't work because the Mega Drive didn't sell that well in Japan compared to America. So the American approach was probably the best. They should have probably gotten Japanese celebrities on board, the same idea. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, that really did work, like to bring mainstream audiences onto it. The people that would buy the Super Nintendo probably onto this first. But I think it was a good idea at the time, just because they already had these games out, that's all. And later on, start doing the celebrity stuff, which I don't think Sega Japan ever did. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, by this point, they already had the Master System, the Mark III, so there was a library of games that were more home console based. I think, though, there was still this thought that, like, a video game's a video game. You can play it at the arcade, you can play it at home, and, like, absolutely, I still love having a home version of Outrun. I still love having a home version of Space Harrier, but if you're exclusively marketing the Mega Drive as a home arcade machine, you need to remember that people have a lot more time at home, so they're more than happy to have like a longer platformer and RPG, and they eventually did that. But I think out the gate, it's just kind of a cheap and easy way to make games for the console. It's very clear that they weren't like kicking off with an RPG. I think it would have been interesting if the Mega Drive launched with like, I don't know, Phantasy Star 2, something like that, to just be like, look, you get the arcade experience, but you're also getting something bigger. Also, I have to wonder if arcade owners didn't like that, because they're like, oh, you want us to buy a deluxe Space Harrier cabinet, but you're also selling the game for like $50 to people, you know?
Oh, yeah.
But I think there was also a thought that if people fell in love with a game in the arcades, they would go home, and in the case of this game, it's the sequel. So it's not the same game, it's a follow-up, but it's a game that made the transition from arcades to home consoles with the follow-up. And there are very few Sega arcade games that have done this. I'm trying to think, maybe Crazy Taxi did it. Crazy Taxi 1 was arcades. Crazy Taxi 2 was home console exclusive, I believe. 3 most definitely was.
Yeah, 3 was.
But I also should note, too, that the American cover art is the Japanese cover art, but it doesn't wrap around at the back, unfortunately. But it's still cool that they actually still utilized, that Japanese art. It looks cool. But, I think what made Space Harrier 2 so exciting was that it was indeed a true official sequel to the original game, though, like I mentioned, Space Harrier 3 actually predates that game by 8 months, and that's really making this more of Space Harrier 3. But that would probably throw people off, because this is Space Harrier 3D, Space Harrier 2. It's almost like, which one comes first?
Yeah.
Yeah, they should swap them. They should.
So it's 1, 2, and 3D.
And there's that nasty artwork on the front there with his... There you go. Look at that. Let's read the story. And the story actually... The only place I could find it was in the game's manual. It wasn't like typed up anywhere. So let's read it. This will get pretty trippy. So the year is 6236. Space is your battlefield, and destructive forces your enemy, and destructive forces your enemy once again. Whoa. I think I found a typo in the first sentence. Space is your battlefield, and destructive forces your enemy once again as Space Harrier confronts another crisis in Space Harrier 2. Only this time the call for help comes from somewhere deep in the universe, the 214th sector, which is light years from your cruiser. However, you're armed with the Cosmic Gate, a special teleportation device, so you're there in moments. And what you see is disastrous. Fantasyland? You mean Fantasy Zone. Fantasyland's in Disneyland. Is unrecognizable. What's clear are enemy forces, lots of them coming at you from everywhere. This is badly written. And there's only you and your laser. This is going to be a tough assignment at which to succeed whether your rapid fire is on or off. So follow the path to victory by staying out of the line of fire and shooting straight. It's a long and ugly road, and the only ones who survive have the makings of a real hero. Your objective is to survive 12 stages of intense combat with a horde of masterful foes, outwit their strategy, and you'll save Fantasyland from being blown to oblivion with you going along for the ride. Huh.
Very...
Thoughts?
That was a bizarre... I mean, like, they put a lot of thought into it, you could tell, especially the writing. It was, like, very Shakespearean. It was highbrow. It was, it has everything. It has a teleporter, it has Stargate, it has Star Wars with the Chosen One. I don't know, man. It seems pretty explosive to me. What about you?
I mean, there's very clear, just like straight up poorly written sentences there, so I don't know how serious to take it. But at the same time, they get as specific as the 214th sector. So there you go.
I wonder what that means.
What I find interesting, I'm not too well versed in the Space Harrier lore, but it's seeming to sound like this is a guy who like flies around the universe saving places, and he more often than not finds himself going to the fantasy zone.
It's like a Green Lantern.
I guess I'm gonna not take Fantasyland as accurate. I think that's a mistranslation. Yeah. Which leads me to believe that the Japanese manual probably has a more accurate reading of this, but I'm assuming also the Cosmic Gate's a real thing. And you see that in the game. When you start up, there's actually a cool thing where he's like standing. I always thought it was like a VR simulation that he was entering, but that's actually the Cosmic Gate you're viewing there. And we actually have some gameplay playing, so you can see all that crazy shit going on.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of gameplay, actually, little has changed between Space Harrier and the sequel. Do not expect the jump from like Sonic 1 to 2 or Streets of Rage 1 to 2. The game does offer 13 stages and some new bosses, and one cool addition is actually a crack of lightning in the sky as the bosses appear. However, absent, again, are the dragon bonus stages, but this time he isn't kidnapped. Instead, the player rides on top of a jet in a regular stage that just has, like, invincibility. So, I mean, do you think Space Harrier suffers from a lack of innovation? I think it does. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot you could do with it. Like, if you just sat there and think about it, like adding layers to it, like it's just a rail shooter, sure, but like there's so much things you could change about it instead of just reusing the same ideas with the pillars and all that and the same aiming. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like the aiming in Space Harrier is kind of made for the arcade with the stick for the corners and stuff, with the cornering. So, like, they always copy that too, right? So it's like they never really think to change it for the console. This is only on console anyway. Why are you making it like a arcade game? Maybe add more cutscenes, more something. It needs more, you know. It always feels like it's bare-boned, like a fast game to get out there. I mean, all the Space Harriers are like that, but isn't like the first Space Harrier like super long? It has like a lot of levels,
like 18 stages, I think. When we did our podcast, we talked about how long it was. We were almost complaining it was too long, but now I think we're like, oh, that's great. There's so much, because the thing is it's not like other arcade games that would just repeat themselves. Like, you get to a certain point and it repeats. Like, each stage is unique. There's unique enemies, unique music, and then the game has a very clear, definitive the end. And I mean, with Space Harrier 2, I think it definitely does suffer from a lack of innovation. It's just the same template on a less powerful console. And you'd think like, okay, the hardware is not really there, but then what you do is you add something that you can't do in the arcades, or add something you want to do before. They could have put a shop, like an item shop in between stages, because if you're going to this cosmic gate, that means you're kind of going back to your ship. So why not have something in the ship? They could have done a level select so that you could start at any stage, and then the game starts at like level 4 and then goes to 12 and then does 1, 2, 3 and concludes. They could have done something like that. They could have had a second player, like a 2-player experience, or a female Harrier.
That'd be cool.
Harriet?
Yeah, I would like the 2-player
But they didn't.
option. Yeah.
They didn't. Instead, they just, had the Mega Drive attempting to replicate super scalar effects,
Which
and
it looks
doing
nice.
an okay job.
It does
nice
look
look nice.
It
Looks far. It looks far better than the Master System port of Space Harrier, which I don't believe we touched on too much in the last episode. But that's basically a scaled down port of Space Harrier with a exclusive boss at the end who returned in the 3D Classics release, pretty much. And I do think, though, that if you sit back now and play Space Harrier 2 like on a 32X and then pop in the 32X port of Space Harrier, I mean, there's no competition. The 32X port of Space Harrier looks amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Because the 32X brought superscalar effects to the Genesis, and it's actually a shame that Outrun never got its 32X release, because I think it would have been amazing to get that, or any other games. What do you think about this idea? What if M2 created a port of Space Harrier 2 for arcades like they did with Fantasy Zone 2? Would you like to see something like that?
Yeah, like that was actually one of the things I was disappointed that they never announced when they were doing all these. After they did Fantasy Zone 2, I was like almost like 100% sure that Space Harrier 2 was going to get a like remake with some sort of like connection to the first game, maybe changing up some stuff. Right now I'm showing the gameplay, and you get on top of a ship, like a little like surfboard thing. Like there's so much little things they could have brought back and like expanded on. Like I feel like Fantasy Zone 2 did that really well. Not only that, they added those extra features where you play as the brother and stuff. So they could have done the same thing with this game. They could have bridged it better with the first one and added more content, right? Give it for a good release. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the lack of innovation shows because Yu Suzuki did not return to make this game. In fact, the sequel was planned by Kotaro Hayashida, who was the creator of Alex Kidd. So maybe his heart wasn't in it. Maybe he just was given the job to make a game that was Space Harrier 2, and he just didn't think to plus it. I think if Yu Suzuki was behind it, he probably would go, what can I do to kind of improve the experience or try something new? We did mention on our Space Harrier episode that the original intent was for it to be a jet fighter game, and that's kind of what Afterburner became. So I think it is interesting that the bonus stage is on a jet fighter, because it's basically the closest Space Harrier gets to the original iteration of Space Harrier. There were several ports of the game to European computers, including the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, and the ZX Spectrum. I took some images here from Hardcore Gaming 101. Look at this nonsense. What do you think?
Wow. Yeah. I'll stick with the... I'm good. But, like, I never owned any of these computers. I really wonder if there's, like, hardcore collectors for, like, a Commodore 64. And I'm sure there are, because I've seen, Jaguar, CDI people online. Mm-hmm. I just don't know, like, how big all these are. But, like, it always amazes me what's, like, that Sega games weren't really Sega exclusives back then. They were, like, the first company to have, like, a console and then being like, all right, we're going to put them on computers and try to make as much money off of these guys too. But yeah.
Right, and it's funny because, in the early 2000s, people were going, I cannot believe that there is a Sega game on a Nintendo console. Little do they realize that the NES had Sega games on it. They were licensed out and not developed by Sega itself, but just like these Amiga ports and ZX Spectrum, they were made by external developers, but it was basically a remake of the game from Sega. But as you can see, like a lot of, the memory on these things was not great. They really look, I don't want to say bad because I understand that they had their limitations, but it's almost like if you have a game as complex as Space Harrier that is already struggling to run on the Genesis, maybe don't make it for the ZX Spectrum. Make games that the ZX Spectrum can run perfectly,
like maybe like Alex Kidd or something.
Maybe, but like I know full well that there are like Commodore 64 fans who are like, they know what the greatest games are for the console, and they're definitely not ports of Sega arcade games.
Oh,
they're always something more simplistic that work well in the confines of that. I mean, some of the best Atari games are games made specifically for the Atari with the limitations in mind. And then some of the worst Atari games are ports of games that just never should have run on it. I'd love to see, though, a demake of Space Harrier for the 2600, and I have to wonder if that already exists. That would be really cool. Yeah. Now we're moving on. This is the future, George. So here we go. We are going to be jumping into Planet Harriers. This is a game I've actually wanted to talk about for a long time on Sega Talk, and for a while, I really thought it would be its own episode. I actually, even doing the notes here, thought we'll end it, and we'll do a Planet Harriers episode in the future. But as evidenced, we're at the 50-minute mark. This game really does not have a lot to be said about it. After I did some research, it's a very small, short game, despite looking big and impressive. It released in 2000 to arcades. This was really the big return of Space Harrier to the arcades since the original game. Like, as we've been discussing, these are home console titles, and all of a sudden Space Harrier is making its jump to the arcades again. However, AM2 is not behind it. Yu Suzuki is not behind it. It is running on the Sega Hikaru board, which is most notable for running Star Wars Racer and one of the Virtua On games. So on a technical level, it's amazing. It features something called Phong Shading, which I kind of feel like I should have looked up before just saying Phong Shading, because I don't know what the hell that is. But so Phong Shading is a computer graphics interpolation technique for surface shading invented by the pioneer Bui Tong Phong.
Oh,
and
yeah, I knew that.
I guess if you can imagine, so imagine a sphere, but it almost looks like it's out of the game Rez, like a disco ball. And then imagine a perfectly round marble with sun, like a sun reflecting in it. That is Phong Shading. So it basically takes this data of all these different cubic colors and kind of merges them together into a clearly defined shape, even though the shape itself is actually still made up of blocky polygons. So that's pretty impressive, that a game in the 2000s was basically appearing to be completely reflective surfaces, rather than, like, if you're watching on video, I have a sheen on my forehead that looks very impressive, but imagine it being like 4 pixel blocks. That's what the Phong Shading's doing there. It also has an amazingly long draw distance, particle effects, and a large number of light sources and polygons on screen. The game was developed by Amusement Vision, who made the Virtua Strikers, Super Monkey Ball, and Spike Out games. And it was directed by Toshihiro Nagoshi, who left Sega not too long ago.
See ya.
And we
Yeah.
never newsed it because our site was down for 2 days.
Yeah.
And it's so funny that, like, probably some of the biggest Sega news we still haven't newsed.
I
think we got to that point where we're like,
what do you think about him
What?
leaving? Like, I mean, he's been in the company since, let's be honest, when he made his Daytona USA debut. It's been like he's been...
mm-hmm.
I would say this is probably when he was kind of slumping it. Like, it felt like he just started his own, like, studio, and he was doing Spike Out. He was trying to do the same thing he did at AM2. It wasn't his Yakuza stuff yet, or going away from all that.
right.
And he was trying to, like... It looked like he was basically trying to make AM Studios 2 Part 2, but under his control and under his rules. Because, like, he was doing this...
Right, yeah. I mean, I definitely think that elements of Shenmue, Daytona, Space Harrier rubbed off on him, but it's clear that he had visions of his own that he wanted to, I guess, see come to life. But he also understood that there were some legacy titles that would probably just help him as a developer move up in the ranks at Sega. And I think if you're told, hey, you got free reign on making a sequel to Space Harrier, you're not going to say no. But I will say that I feel like this game has a lot more visually in common with Spike Out and F-Zero GX than it does Space Harrier. I don't think that, and we'll get into the environments and stuff in a moment. But what I did want to do is, instead of talking about Nagoshi, because we've talked about him a lot in the past, we probably will do a Nagoshi-centric episode in the near future. I want to talk about another member of the team, and that's the game's main program director, Tetsuo Kaku. And I just kind of plucked him at random. He was at the top of the list. He's someone we've never talked about. I think it's interesting to see these people's names who appear on a lot of great games but never really see what they do or what they've worked on. Kaku was a frequent collaborator with Nagoshi. He started at Sega actually with Virtua Fighter, so all the way back then as a programmer. He worked on the franchise up to 3TB, and then he became a chief programmer on Spike Out, which many have said is kind of the precursor to Yakuza in terms of the gameplay style. I thought this was really interesting. He programmed the web browser implementation for Sonic Adventure. And he also worked on Shenmue, Super Monkey Ball, F-Zero, AX, and GX, and on Yakuza 2, Yakuza 3, Yakuza 4, Kiwami, and Kenzan, in some cases as a chief programmer. So that original Yakuza, which has become kind of lost to time. Like, I feel like the Kiwami games have really overwritten
the lore,
the Yakuza titles.
Yeah.
Well, not just the lore, but the gameplay. I feel like you talk to some people now, and they're like, "I'm a huge Yakuza fan. Played all the games," and you go, "Did you play the PlayStation 2 ones?" And they're like, "No." And it's like, check them out. It's a completely different experience from what you think you're going to get.
It is. And there's like, I don't know, I think there's something really charming about the models they used and the art style for the PS2. It has its own charm. There's this weird, like, like Kiwami has this little weird kind of like slap together thing where they're using some motion capture of the PS2, but it doesn't translate well to more higher quality, like, models sometimes. Like, you start noticing their eyes don't move at all sometimes, and you're like, what? But it worked for the PS2 because they're so low quality. Yeah.
And the worlds you explore, people will say, oh, Yakuza's the precursor, or it's like the successor to Shenmue. It isn't. You play that original Yakuza game, it is not a behind-the-back, fully world-exploring game. Isn't it? It's more like playing a Resident Evil title with, like, fixed cameras and small environments.
It's like it's kind of like they took, like, Spike Out, and then they were like, let's put it in an RPG-type world, instead of, like, making an RPG or a simulation game from ground up. That's what it feels like.
I guess I should say it's more like Final Fantasy X, where it's, like, fixed cameras and minimal exploration, but large settings. So you feel like it's a big world, and it is, but not in the sense of like Shenmue, where it's fully 3D realized, everyone has a life, you're exploring stores and things. That came later. But I do think it's interesting that he started as the chief programmer for Yakuza, and then he ended up working on Kiwami, which was a remake of that. He also worked on Binary Domain. So, I mean, I think it's a really impressive resume. As a chief programmer, he was highly, highly influential in the 3D arcade era and home console era of Sega's third-party era. I think all of his games are highlights of his career, to be quite honest. Nothing on this list really screams like, what? Except for maybe Kenzen, just because it's never been
released here.
Released to the West. Yeah. What do you think of his resume really makes him a fit for Space Harrier? Is there any of these games you think has a Space Harrier vibe?
I would say as a programmer, like Super Monkey Ball, probably just the idea of running, the way that the scale or whatever you scale those graphics. And even if you look at Planet Harriers, it has a very like Wii type of graphical vibe where it's like if this released on Wii, it would be like, oh, this is just another Wii, like top tier looking Wii game. But it came out earlier than the Wii, obviously. And the Wii was, less powerful, but it still looks like kind of like Sin and Punishment 2 from Treasure. It kind of gives me that vibe. Yeah,
and there is this kind, and I don't know if we have the gameplay footage playing right now, but there is a aesthetic to the character designs that I think really scream amusement vision. And when I say that, I mean Spike Out and the F-Zero titles, and maybe even the early Yakuza games to a point, where I don't really know how to describe it. It's almost like accentuated legs, very unique face designs. They don't look anime so much as they look cartoonish.
It's like the kid trend in this era, like for kid cartoons, isn't it? What I'm thinking, like it kind of looks like Knights, or I don't know. It's weird. Like they don't have the checkered boards like they used to in the other one.
No. And it's interesting though that this game, when it was released, it was hailed as having the best arcade graphics of the time, and was amazingly successful at the 2000 Amusement Machine Show. And was apparently a super successful arcade game in Japan, which saw a worldwide release, but not too many. I've only played this once in the wild. The only other game I can think of that I've seen once in the wild was that skateboarding Jet Set Radio Smile-Bit game.
I forgot what it's called. They used to have that one in my theater, but I forgot what it's called.
Ollie King. Yeah. So this is a rare one. Even Galloping Ghost doesn't have this, or Ollie King. If they ever did, I would be like, if they announced it today, I'd log off and just go do it, because it's like I don't want the game to break down. I want to play it again. But you mentioned it lacks the checkerboard patterns. I think, as much as I'd love to see those, I think doing away with them meant that they could make such a technically impressive game. Otherwise, people would go, "Oh, cool! You made a checkerboard pattern." Like I get it. Now, this isn't in the notes, but Strike Harbinger, aka Strike Blazinger, I don't know where that game is right now in terms of development. We've been talking about it since 2017. I think that's when I played it. It's from Hitsparks Games, which is made up of Chris Tang and Kiyoshi Okuma. Now, their game is a straight up what a 3D version of Space Harrier would be. And it is amazing. It's so fun. And there are development things they shared with me that I can't publicly talk about. But that feels like the evolution of Space Harrier in 3D. This game, to me, it plays more like Panzer Dragoon.
Yeah.
It's slower moving. It's a lot easier. It's shorter. I think it lacks a lot of the lore and the rules made in the Space Harrier games. The cabinet, it's a twin-seated cabinet, which allows for simultaneous two-player games, simultaneous two single-player games. So you could sit down next to someone and not be playing the same game. or a network 2-player game, which is common. You see that a lot with racing games. Much like the original Space Harrier, there is the joystick, there's missile and bullet trigger buttons, but there are also buttons for changing the view and using bombs, so definitely a evolution there. Though, like I mentioned, I think the biggest change is the setting. You look at this game in action, and outside of someone holding something under their arm and shooting, nothing screams Space Harrier.
No.
They're just like 3D worlds. To be quite honest, I think the aesthetics either look like F-Zero, as I mentioned, or Phantasy Star Online. It's this Sega aesthetic of the 2000s where it's like nature mixed with like techie stuff.
Yeah, it was like that Virtual Quest game also has like that weird look with the big feet and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I love the aesthetic, but it's like a Digimon aesthetic. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to see that anymore. As for the playable characters, there's 4 of them. It's very clear that like they looked at what Space Harrier is. Oh, it's a guy holding a thing. So they're like, okay, well in this game we have 4 characters holding things. So you have the police officer Glenn, who has a giant gun he holds, like a pistol. We have Nurse Corey, who has a giant syringe, and she's in the gameplay we're looking at. We have baseball player Nick with his bat called the Nick Special, big baseball bat, and then Rockstar X with his guitar.
Little bizarre.
What do you think about these
yeah,
guys?
That's
do you
bizarre.
like these?
No, because it's like, okay, so you play the other one, you're a spaceman, right? It makes sense, right? You traveled multi-dimensions, and now you're a baseball player, a nurse that shoots out of her needle. A giant needle? Why?
Right.
Like, I get that you guys are having fun with it, but definitely, like, if anybody should have stopped, it would have been like Yu Suzuki. It's like, okay, dude, he's a spaceman. It's like, I don't know. It's kind of weird. I guess they were going for more of a goofy take. Like, wouldn't it be cool if a nurse was one of the shooters? I mean, one of the Space Harriers?
It's like, so the original Space Harrier games have this lore. It's obvious this guy's the Harrier. He has this tech. This is a machine that he uses. It's not, I don't think it's exclusive to him. I think it's just a machine that whatever force he fights for uses. And I think it's just, on one hand, like, I love this. On the other hand, I hate this. It's weird because I'm like it's quirky, funny, cool, but at the same time, it's just like completely missing the point of Space Harrier, both aesthetically and I think like plot wise. It's just, I don't know. It almost feels like these are the characters you would create in addition to Harrier being in this game, but he's not.
Yeah, that's weird.
And I think it's a real missed opportunity to maybe, because this game is coming out years after the original, they should have had an older Harrier. So like a guy with like gray sideburns in the original costume with the thing. So like, yeah, you're all going to pick that one. But if you don't want to pick him, you can always pick Corey with the syringe or Nick with the bat just for fun. But it just seems like a misstep to be like, there is no main character. The main character is not in this game. If anything, and this is what I both love and kind of dislike about the game, is that there is a 5th hidden character. You can access them pretty easily through some, I forgot what the code is exactly, but it's Opa-Opa.
Oh.
Opa-Opa himself is in the main game. He arrives as you play the game to revive players using a continue. And of course, this ties the Space Harrier games in with Fantasy Zone, a connection the franchise has always had. This would make this Opa-Opa's first fully 3D appearance in a full game. He later appeared in Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, but it just seems weird to me that the one character who feels really true and right for the Fantasy Zone should be Space Harrier, because this is a Space Harrier game.
Yeah.
But your next best option is Opa-Opa. You know, like,
it kind of makes it seem like they started development on this game as like oh, this is influenced by like Space Harrier, but it's its own game, and Sega's like, no, it has to have direct tie into the arcade game, and so they called it Planet Harriers. Pretty sure it was going to be its own game, its own light gun shooter with its own world. I don't know, because it's weird that you wouldn't even put the main character in the game. Like, isn't that kind of strange?
It is, and it's not even like there's a legacy or they reference him or like this is his son. There's none of that. It's just like these are 4 other guys holding things, and I guess in Space Harrier people hold things, and the thing they hold is like what they are. So if you're a spaceman, you have a rocket, but he's not in this one. You're a nurse, you have a syringe. Makes no sense. Players have health bars. The game features lock-on, like Afterburner. And in 2-player games, I think this is kind of cool. Players can dock and recover each other's life. The game's brief, though. It has 5 stages. And this is where I was saying at the beginning that as crazy as the Space Harrier game titles are, Planet Harriers kind of drops the ball. So the first one is Windle, Windel. It's a green landscape. The next one is Foreo, which is a forest. Okay, cool. The next one is called Lava, Lavaa.
2 A's.
Can you guess what this
lava? It's a lava
this
stage.
stage has? Lava, yeah. And then they get super creative. The next one's called Cavern.
Ooh, could be anything.
Cavern, which is just a word for cave.
Yeah.
And that's what you see. And then the last one is Galax, which is basically galaxy minus the Y. And, surprise, surprise, it takes place in outer space. So, 5 stages doesn't seem that impressive. Some of the titles are a little forgettable. The bosses are static. You reach the end of the stage and then they're just kind of there and you float in front of them and fight. There's 5 of them. There's a multi-headed dragon, which is the most Space Harrier of them all. There's an eyeball monster. There's a living mummy coffin. There's a gooey starfish, and then a series of cubes that take on different forms. And one of the forms is actually the Dreamcast logo, which is pretty funny. Again, for a game that's a sequel to Space Harrier, it's really more a Fantasy Zone game because there is a item shop, like the parts shop in Fantasy Zone. Players can buy weapons and upgrades to refill. It's called the Star Shop. This is weird. It's maintained by 2 shopkeepers, but they appear at random. So you either get this basically hunky naked old man wearing a red apron, or a woman in like a metal chastity dress.
Yeah.
Like it's got a big lock on it, so it's like she can't remove it.
Yeah.
It's very weird.
Something weird going on.
You enter this stage. It's bizarre. Like he's sexy, she's sexy. They appear at random. Why did they design 2 shopkeepers? You didn't need to do that. And you can either enter the stage through portals like you would in Fantasy Zone, or between stages, again like Fantasy Zone, and you spend gold that you collect from fallen enemies. Though I will say, it sounds like I'm being negative, I think this is the best improvement to the Space Harrier formula. I think it's a fun tie-in with Fantasy Zone. What do you think about this shop?
I like it. I like the idea of the shop. I like the idea that there's like a guy that has like, they're both sexy, right? But like the guy is like wearing an apron and he's naked, so it's like easy to access. Like you just, and then the other girls are like in all metal sexy suit, but with like a lock, so you can't actually like. You know what I mean? It's just like the weird dynamics of the guy naked and the girl like behind a metal tin thing. It's just so strange. It's like, what are you guys thinking when you guys were doing this? I like the idea of the shop.
And let me just say how...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
I like the idea of the shop.
I was just going to say how progressive of us to be like, this guy's sexy. We don't have any problem with it.
I don't have any problems with the guy being sexy. Especially old people. They have to be
neither.
sexy
I think
too.
He looks awesome.
Yeah.
Nothing better than a sexy old man.
I do like that they kept the running on the ground. I thought that was pretty cool because, like, it's 3D.
Mm-hmm.
They had to do the animation. But it does remind me more of like a cross between like Panzer Dragoon-ish or whatever with the lock on and all that, and the way it looks in 3D. And
yeah.
But I do like the shop. I think it's a cool addition. I hope that if they ever do a new M2 or something, that they think about adding a shop And it would be cool to, I mean, it's never going to happen, but it would be cool to have an official port of this one day. Like the lost arcade games from Sega. But
oh, yeah.
I don't think
absolutely.
it'll ever happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just skip ahead briefly to mention that I think if it does see a port, the best opportunity is in a new Yakuza or Judgment game, just because they seem to be cherry-picking one game that has either never been released or generationally has not been released. So we had Sonic the Fighters come back to modern consoles with Lost Judgment. We had I'm blanking, but it's like a bizarre racing game. Yeah, that no one ever talks about.
Yeah.
So I think, given the Nagoshi connection, it would be amazing if Planet Harrier found its way into like Yakuza 8. I think they definitely should consider that. I hope they have a short list of games where they're like, look, M2's not going to do it. It works with our legacy. Let's do it. I mean, it's a part of the Monkey Ball family, pretty much, Amusement Vision. So why not? You know, it's got a direct connection to the Yakuza franchise, just in terms of the creatives working on it. I thought the ending of the game was interesting. So it shows a player flying through space, and then there's a man and his kid. And I don't know if they've ever appeared in the game, but they're just like walking. It's like a guy and his kid, and they stop and look up and see like the player flying through the sky. And then there's a message, and the message is very strange. It says, "In remembrance to all dear games born in the 20th century."
What?
And I think what the message means, because the game came out in 2000, it's almost saying like, we are moving into the 21st century. This game is remembering all the games that were made in the past century, aka every single video game up until this point. You know, it's a very strange kind of melancholic message. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Imagine a movie that came out in the year 2000 ends, and it's like, let's take a moment to remember every movie made in the last 100 years. And you're like, oh, okay, I didn't know we were going to be doing this, but, you know, I'll say a prayer for, like, Charlie Chaplin, I guess. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, it is kind of weird. It would have been, like, I don't know, like, doing a, like, I don't know, like, a tribute to, like, maybe the actual, like, Space Harrier franchise, not just every single game that ever came out. It was, like, would have been sick if they showed, like, you know, like, this one came out in this year, 3D came out this year, you know, start actually talking about the franchise that you're trying to make a sequel to or a final game to.
They could have said, see you next game, but instead they're like, let's bring you down for a weird moment.
It's the last game ever
made. But yeah,
made.
that pretty much closes the book on Space Harrier sequels. Like, that's about it, but I definitely have loose ends from our 2017 episode. One that I believe was an omission is that there was this bizarre game. So this is Typing Space Harrier.
Oh, man.
It was a Sega PC title for Windows 98, ME, 2000, and XP. So I'm assuming you could probably find this and download it and try it. But yeah, like the title says, it's pretty much like Typing of the Dead, but Space Harrier. Instead of the fire button, you type out words. It's basically the graphics of the original, only released in Japan. Weird.
So it's in Japanese then. You can't really play it.
I don't think so. Typing of the Dead does have English, so I'd imagine this does too, but I would also imagine there's a lot of Japanese, and so it's probably unplayable. The other one, this one is weird. So we may have briefly touched on this, but because our previous one was not a video format, you couldn't see the cover art. But yeah, 2003 saw the release of Sega Ages 2500 Series Volume 4. So if you remember, I talked about Volume 20 from M2, which was a compilation of all the Space Harrier games. But Volume 4 was developed by the company 3D Ages. So when the Sega Ages 2500 PlayStation 2 titles started, the mission was to remake games in 3D with remastered music. And despite the effort, though, it's just an okay attempt at moving the original 3D. Interestingly, there is the lock-on feature found in Planet Harriers, and also a fractal mode, which replaces the checkerboards with more realistic scenery. So it's almost like it has the best of both worlds there. If you ever want to try this, though, it does have a Western release. I'm actually holding it in my hand here. It is called Sega Classics Collection.
Yeah.
And this, I'm looking at it on the back here. I'm pretty sure it's the same game, but it's just weird. It's
the
like
3D one where they redid the actual Harriers design, right?
Right, that's what's so weird is it's not a straight port, but they actually completely redesigned him. He's got like a little helmet, he's got little hair coming out of the back, all the enemies look different. It's very much its own thing. It definitely does not look like Space Harrier, but it's also kind of like what you'd imagine a true 3D sequel to Space Harrier would look like. It looks more like Space Harrier than, like Strike Harbinger or what is that, Xenocider.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. It's not a great game though, but it is definitely accessible through Sega Classics Collection. This collection is weird because if you just look at the cover, you would think it's just like an arcade port collection or maybe a Sega Genesis collection. It does not really explain what it is. It never mentions Sega Ages. It never says like these are cherry-picked Sega Ages titles. It also is bizarre because in Japan you're buying a single disc to play Space Harrier, whereas this contains, I believe, 9 of the Sega Ages titles. So it's very clear that they were extremely small.
Oh yeah,
and they could have fit a lot more on a disc. PAL owners unfortunately miss out on Alien Syndrome, which was removed from their release to lower the age rating. Have you ever played this collection? Do you have it?
Yeah, I have, and I do have it. I played it like briefly. I'm not really the big fan of like remaking these. I think that like this is cool and everything, but like it kind of misses the whole point of why Space Harrier, the first one, was like iconic, and it's like design, the look. It's kind of like if they made a 3D version of like the Sonic 2, and it's like, well, yeah, but look at the way they did. Like, there's something about the checker pattern and how it all came together that you kind of like even now. Like, even though we could obviously make it look way nicer, you're still going like, every time I play Sonic 2, I'm always impressed. Like, oh, really nice art design, very well done. So it's like kind of the same thing with me with Space Harrier. It's like, that's cool, but I'm gonna play the arcade one probably. That's how I feel, but yeah.
It's an interesting compilation. I think there are some highlights, like Fantasy Zone is a almost like Jet Set Radio cel-shaded remake of the game, so it switches to like first person, which is really cool. Columns, though, like you didn't need to remake that in 3D. Yeah, it's just a 2D puzzle game.
Oh, yeah, you do. You need to also add a story mode and like RPG mode onto it.
It's strange. There's Virtua Racing, which is already a pretty cool looking 3D game, but they like remade it.
More 3D.
But it looks old, but it looks new. Outrun in 3D. This is like your Outrun 1 in 3D, which is just bizarre because Outrun 2 was in 3D.
Yeah.
So it's a curiosity. I would say definitely pick it up because it's the only way you're going to get Sega Ages titles in America. And it's a good peek at what the early titles were before M2 took over.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of M2 and Sega Ages, the line actually did see a revival on the Nintendo Switch with Space Harrier included. Features from the 3DS 3D Classic release were included, including widescreen support, the exclusive final boss Haya-O, who was from the Master System version, as well as new modes. The most notable addition is a new mode called Kommenu Barrier Attack, in which a pair of lion-like statues who were originally seen guarding the Shinto shrines, like in Japan, surround the player and create a barrier protecting the player from collisions. What I think is interesting, though, is these creatures are in the original game, but they're protecting the Stage 17 boss, whose name is Wee Wee Jumbo. Which sounds like a big... I have a Wee Wee Jumbo
Big. That's what you would name your penis when you were a kid. Wee Wee Jumbo.
Wee Wee Jumbo. Sega's press release said that with the exception of bullets, the barrier protects Harrier from all enemies and obstacles, like running into him. So now you can proactively destroy obstacles and invincible enemies like Bin's Beans by ramming into them, which normally had to be avoided other than riding Urea. However, if Kommenu himself is attacked, the barrier will disappear for a fixed period of time. So it's a cool, like, easy mode, but it has its, like, difficult setting. What do you think of that? I mean, it's no Space Harrier 2 remake, but it's something.
You're right. I think they, sometimes the extra features that AM2 did were either like really well done and really well executed, or sometimes they felt like they were just half-assed in it sometimes, and some of them got like the shorter end.
Right.
Like I think one of the better ones was like Outrun. They had all those cool features that like you could take away the cars. So technically, if one day you just want to come home from work and ride your vehicle in an open road, you can do that. There's nothing like that on this,
right.
Is there? Where you could take all the bad guys out and just dodge. So it's
no, not to my knowledge. No.
Yeah. They could have done more. Obviously, it's I still think it's crazy that the one that got the most attention, love, and money was the Fantasy 7 2 port. Like, such a weird...
Yeah.
And, like, the Sonic games didn't really get that much stuff. They added some things here and there, but, like, I still think the Whitehead versions were superior. At least that I know of, right?
It seems like Sega of Japan still wants to throw money at Sonic 1 and 2 remakes, even though they already have them. It's a very weird waste of resources. I just ignore Sonic 1 and 2 on Sega Ages and I don't know, work on other things. There is another thing. So I've never tried this. I want to try it, though. I just purchased the game today, actually, for the Switch. Is a control scheme that mimics the arcade flight stick using the Switch Joy-Con and accelerometer in an upright mode. So you hold the Joy-Con and you can do this.
I didn't know that.
Fly. Have you tried that?
No, I haven't. I do own it.
Yeah, that's cool.
I didn't know that. I'm going to try it.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. It's cool.
Yeah. It's not as intuitive. So I sang the praises of the 3D Classic Space Harrier, which I think might have been like my game of the year at one point when there wasn't that much releasing. But there are a few modes that are absent from this. For example, the machine moving and making the sounds, I don't believe is in it. Also, the 3DS version, you can use the stylus to move the player around the screen, and it's absolutely amazing. Like, it makes the game not easier, but insanely intuitive. It's the equivalent of touching your finger to a video game screen, and the character will go wherever you move your finger. Like, you can't do that, with any other game unless it's like a mouse. So that is very cool. But by and large, I think the Sega Ages Switch version is probably the best one you can get right now. There's also a version on the Astro City Mini, which is just like the straight up game, which is cool. But yeah, as far as the sequels, they are on the Space Harrier 2 is on the Genesis Mini. Very easy to find and play. So really, I'd say the rarest one is Planet Harriers, followed by Space Harrier 3D. And you're going to have to do some importing or eBay shopping to really get those. And even then, there are some issues with hardware. But yeah, that pretty much covers it for the sequels, the remakes, the remasters. I think we can finally close the book on Space Harrier on Sega Talk. I don't believe we will ever do another episode unless they release a new game.
Oh, I will hope.
So
come on, guys.
I hope. I mean, yeah, come on, do it. But yeah, so what are your final thoughts on the franchise, its sequels, and where would you like it to go next?
I mean, obviously, I would like to have something come back. I think, like, for a long time, I think the last big arcade game, I wouldn't say that because we also had Daytona or whatever in arcades, but, like, the last time Sega made a big deal about, like, bringing a big franchise and making a sequel was Outrun 2. and it got like 5 re-release, some crazy amount. They got a PSP port. It was like they went all out on that game, and I haven't seen them do anything like that where like they actually made a really good new game like that. Like Outrun 2, and like I told you, it's going to be our 100th episode. Is one of my favorite games that they've released. More modernly. I know it's been like 15 years, but I hope that they. I hope, but I feel like we're already coming to an end from this like Sega arcade, and Sega's moving more towards like maybe bringing back console stuff. Like we already got a new Alex Kidd, Streets of Rage, but I would love to see a new actual Space Harrier 3 where like you play as the actual character and it's in 3D and it's maybe a little title that it's like kind of like an indie budget title with cool art. That'd be sick. Mm-hmm. What about you?
Yeah. I think if we do see it, it's probably going to be like a digital-only indie budget title that really appeals to kind of the same crowds that love shmups, the same crowds that love, maybe like a Mega Man 9, like those sort of D-makes. It was mentioned in our Space Harrier episode that, and I think this the most interesting thing I mentioned in the episode was that Space Harrier is like a run and gun. It's like a shmup, but like a first person shmup. And if you can imagine a demake of Space Harrier from the side, it would really probably appeal to that sort of crowd, no question. But because you're going forward, it's kind of moved into its own category of like super scalar flight game. And so I think if we see another one, I think shifting perspectives would be interesting. I think to have some stages moving sideways, maybe for a bonus stage, might be fun. I think if they do make another, make it a compilation with a new game so that you can experience 1 3D, 2 Planet Harriers, and then like the new edition. And that's why I think M2 would probably be the best choice, just because instead of releasing some snazzy 3D sequel, it would be something that would appear to be a lost like super scalar 80s game, but with some like Sonic Mania touches. We were like, oh, they can't do that. Like the hardware could never do that, but it can. But yeah, just something that celebrates the legacy. And I think if Sega wants to revive this and other titles like that, stop thinking of it as an arcade title and think of it more as a celebration of Sega's legacy by both collecting titles and putting some new experiences on there. And I think it could happen. But until then, I will miss talking about Space Harrier on these shows. 2017 was the last time. 2021 is probably the final time. But it's time to move on. We will discuss more classic arcade games in the near future. But until then, I want to hear from the Patreon audience. If you support us at any tier, your memories will be read aloud no matter how much you type, which pains me to say. We had Daniel Andres. He said, the only memory I really have is playing Space Harrier 3D Remake on the PS2 Sega Classics collection. Does that really even count? Not sure. And I swear that I've played Planet Harriers before at an arcade a few years back somewhere, or at least saw it in person. I also think that I recently put Space Harrier 2 on my Genesis EverDrive, but I haven't gotten around to playing it yet. Regardless of all that, I still love Space Harrier, at least the original one. Alex Hughes says, out of all the sequels, I've only played Space Harrier 2, which I want to play more of, but I always find myself going back to the first game because the music is so good. Yeah. I have never played Planet Harrier, but I think I vaguely recall seeing it at some arcade, like Chuck E. Cheese, I don't know, though it kind of reminds me of a bit of Sin and Punishment Star successor on the Wii.
That's what I said.
Do you see that?
Yeah, I do see that. I was playing actually the Sin and Punishment game not that long ago, so that's what I'm seeing a little bit of.
Interesting. And then finally we have Taze Bell, and I love this comment. I've never played any of the sequels, but I am aware of Space Harrier 2. Not exactly the most interesting memory, but yeah. What a way to end it. So, George, do you want to reveal what we're going to be talking about after the Thanksgiving holiday when we dive into December?
I think we're going to be talking... Well, I'm going to be doing Shenmue 2, right? Or am I doing 3? Or you're doing 3, I'm doing 2. And then I'm doing...
That's next year.
Actually, Astro... I'm doing... what's the game called now? Now it's escaping me. Astro Boy, the one on Game Boy Advance. Yes.
Omega Factor.
Omega Factor, the Game Boy Advance one, the better one I'm going to be talking about. And I actually kind of like the game. It's a treasure and I think Hitmaker crossover game on the Game Boy Advance. It's actually really I want to say underrated. It has a cult classic. It has fans of it. It's definitely going to be an interesting episode. We're going to be talking about Astro Boy, Hitmaker, and crossover developers because it's two big developers coming and working together. So we might talk more about any time in history where that happened too. So it's gonna be an interesting episode. We'll catch you guys on the next episode of Sega Talk. Bye.
Bye.
Game over. Thank you for playing.